All right, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's MarkMonitor webinar, Safeguarding Your Organization from Social Engineering Attacks. I'm Erin Bryant, and I'll be moderating today's event. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping items. During today's event, all participants' lines will be muted. This is to ensure that there isn't any background noise or interference. Following today's presentation, we'll be holding a Q&A session. To submit a question for our speaker, please use the Q&A tab located on your WebEx console. We are recording today's webinar, and we will send out a follow-up email to everyone with a link to the recording and presentation slides, so please be on the lookout for those materials. With that, I'd like to introduce Akino Chikada, our speaker for today's session. Akino is a Senior Brand Protection Product Marketing Manager for MarkMonitor Anti-Fraud Solutions. With experience in software product marketing, she's most recently been focusing on the growing problem of fraud, phishing, and brand abuse on the Internet. She works closely with leading global brands to understand the fraud and security challenges they face in order to deliver the best solutions to mitigate these risks. So with that, I will go ahead and turn things over to Akino to get us started.
Hi, Erin. Thank you so much. And again, thank you, everyone. Sorry for running a few minutes late, but we appreciate your patience here. So today we're going to talk about safeguarding your organization from social engineering attacks. And as the title suggests, we'll be talking about the online banking landscape, social engineering attacks, and I'll also be providing examples of the different types of abuses that we are seeing, specifically targeting banks. And we'll also cover best practices. Last but not least, we'll have a Q&A session, so please feel free to continuously type in some questions throughout this presentation. So over the past years, banks have been investing more and more in the online channels. And in the last 2 years or so, mobile has been getting the most of attention. In fact, more than 50% of the adults are banking online here in the U.S. And this stat has been growing year over year. So having a safe and secured online banking landscape is very important. According to a recent study, very successful phishing campaigns will actually capture up to 45% of its visitors' data. And what's scary is when you look at least successful scams scored up to 3% of its visitors' data. And if you think about it, when a fraudster sends out a campaign, they might be attacking over 1 million people. And so even 3%, those numbers can easily add up. So security is more critical today than it's ever been before. According to the 2015 Banking Priority Study, social engineering is one of the top 3 concerns for 2015. So it begs the question, what is social engineering? Well, social engineering is the psychological manipulation to get people to divulge confidential and personal information. This could be something like username, password, or even social security number, and it can vary. Social engineering attacks are also typically a bit more complex in nature, and they usually are a multi-pronged approach. They are also looking into new ways to monetize different types of credentials and data. So one key thing that is really important to highlight is that fraudsters are continuously evolving their strategies and their social engineering strategies, which makes it extremely hard to predict and just not predictable. So let's take a look at the social engineering life cycle, and this will help create a framework when we're talking about the various social engineering attacks. So at a very high level, there's 3 phases. The first phase is setting up of the actual social engineering attack. The second phase is the actual launching of the campaign. And then the last phase, which is the ultimate goal here, is collecting credentials and monetization. Now, there are different ways that fraudsters will monetize. including reselling resources and credentials, deepening and broadening data so that they could do more attacks, also hijacking resources. The list is actually longer, so it's not limited to these, but these are just some of the ways that fraudsters are monetizing. And they will use different tactics and channels in order to execute upon their campaigns. Traditionally, the email channel has been the primary digital channel, and most, that's been the primary focus where people are looking for phishing and malware attacks. Phishing and malware attacks via the email channel is still a critical component, and those numbers and the detection levels that we've noted has definitely not gone down. It's definitely a continuous problem, so it's really important to continuously monitor that. However, for the purpose of this webinar, we really wanted to talk about the new emerging trends that we're noticing and focus on different digital channels, including domains, social media, mobile apps, websites, and paid search. And from a tactics level, we'll talk about how they apply all these different tactics, such as phishing, malware, false association, lone lead generators, using all these different channels. So let's start by talking about the domain level. At the domain level, there are different types of problems that we are seeing. Cyber squatting, domain securities, these are the more known issues. But with the introduction of new GTLDs, it's introducing a whole new set of security issues. Cyber squatting is also an issue on new GTLDs, and what we're noticing is that phishing attacks are also happening at the new GTLD level. And on this right-hand side, if you can see, these are the top 10 new GTLDs that our financial institutions or financial services customers have been adding to their portfolio. So that includes like .reviews, .financial, .finance, .cash. These are all the new GTLDs that have been added to their domain portfolios. And just FYI, I know that we're getting a lot of questions about this, is .bank. .bank is going to be hitting sunrise period. The sunrise period begins May 18th. But what's an interesting thing to note about .bank versus some of these other new GTLDs is that .bank actually has more regulations in place. That's not to say that it's 100% secure, but it's definitely noteworthy to comment that .bank has more regulations compared to some of these other new GTLDs, and therefore monitoring all of these new GTLDs is extremely important. So there are a few things that I'd like to highlight here. It's important to have some type of alert so you can keep track of all the new GTLDs that are being launched so that you're continuously up to date. It's also a good thing to have a domain registrar that is truly operating with the highest level of security. So, for example, having two-factor authentication, super locking, and all these high standard security to ensure that you are minimizing your risks. And last but not least, I think it's really important to have some kind of prevention metrics in place. And what I mean by that is to have some type of an alert system where if people are registering domain names using a similar name to your bank, it's something that you'd want to monitor because it's likely that they're either doing this as typo squatting or they're either doing this because they're about to commit some fraudulent activity. So, for example, if my bank name was called The Coolest Bank, instead of having and let's say there's a fraudster, the fraudster might try to register the domain with $000 instead of $00, so that they can start committing some kind of a fraudulent activity. And it goes back to that setup phase. So those are things to keep an eye on and just have visibility. Now, looking at the website channel, there are numerous ways that social engineering attacks could happen. However, the ones that we're seeing more and more of is the lone lead generators and impersonating websites. So on the left-hand side, you'll see this screenshot. I apologize, it's somewhat small, and we've hid the name because it was using an actual legitimate bank's name, and the look and feel of this impersonating website is actually very similar. But what's interesting is if you look at their domain, it's bkbuster.com. And it's an impersonating website. The fact that there is an impersonating website kind of begs the question, or it really highlights the fact that it's very likely that there's some kind of a fraudulent scheme happening in the back end. So it's really hard to tell what exactly the scheme is or what exactly the action item is that the fraudster is asking customers or end users to do. However, when it's illegitimate, then it's likely that there are some fraudulent activity. So it's really important to keep an eye out on those types of illegitimate impersonating websites. Also, lone lead generators, and we know that from our customers, we're getting a ton of questions with regards to this. What is it? What does it mean? Well, what's scary about, or I shouldn't say what's scary, but from a security standpoint, it's really important to be looking at lone lead generator sites that is using your brand name to be capturing credentials. So, for example, you'll see the screenshot. We kind of had to hide the legitimate bank's name, but it's using a legitimate bank's name and diverting traffic to a third-party lone lead generator site that's illegitimate, and this site is asking for all sorts of credentials: full name, address, social security number, driver license information, and it's basically taking and capturing all these credentials. So it's really important to have some kind of visibility to be monitoring all these lone lead generator sites and impersonating websites to understand what kind of fraudulent activities that might be happening. Now let's talk about fraudulent attacks and social engineering attacks that could be happening at the paid search level. Paid search is probably one of the most underestimated or least talked about channels, but it's really important to note that there are fraudulent activities that are happening even at the paid search level. So unfortunately, again, I had to mask the bank's name here, but this example that you can see, it's actually a legitimate bank, and when you click on it, it links people directly to a phishing URL, and it's capturing people's credentials. There are also other schemes and attacks happening, traffic diversion, and again, lone lead generators websites are also promoted at the paid search level. So it is important to be tracking and monitoring the paid search channel. Social media, and social media is another very popular channel where people are promoting all sorts of illegal activities, or illegitimate activities. Again, lone lead generator websites, impersonating websites. But this hashtag phishing example is what I wanted to highlight and talk about. This is definitely something that we're seeing more and more of. Hashtag phishing is essentially, if you look at this right-hand side example, it says, if you bank with X bank, you can make $5,000 cash now. You must have your online account information. Text me now, and there's a telephone number. And then the hashtag phishing portion is at the very end. It's hashtagging your legitimate bank's name to get people and show some form of legitimacy. Now, probably some people, a lot of people were probably more aware that this is likely a fraudulent scheme. However, there are people that might not necessarily put the two and two together, and there's really a money laundering scheme happening on the back end. It's really important to be continuously monitoring social media channels to ensure that these kind of activities are minimized and, enforced upon. Also, the FFIEC also strongly recommends financial institutions to have some kind of a monitoring system to minimize risks. So it's definitely something that is emerging and definitely an important channel to be monitoring. And last but not least, the mobile channel. The mobile channel has been trending in terms of potential fraudulent activities, and they're phishing apps, malware apps, and both of these are considered to be the malicious apps. Malicious apps are basically designed to steal information from the actual device they've been installed on. They're typically found either on third-party stores or malicious websites. Mobile app stores such as iTunes, they've got more security around them, so that's less likely, but definitely the third party or the stores with less security is where you're going to find these malicious type apps. But the key here to note is that, again, they're leveraging legitimate banks and making the mobile app look very legitimate so that people are actively downloading this information. And if you look on the right-hand side, there's a chart here. And this is unfortunate news, but financial services is one of the most targeted industry. And that's because a lot of people are using mobile banking as a primary way to bank, especially with millennials. This is a growing trend. So, unfortunately, where there's money, then fraudsters tend to follow. So it's an opportunity for them, and that makes it extra critical for you to really think about security measures around this channel. So I talked a lot about the different types of examples of how social engineering attacks could be happening, but the one thing that you'll notice is with all these different fraudulent activities that could happen, it really directly impacts your business. The first direct impact is that it really damages your online and mobile channel, especially if a customer or prospect is a victim of one of these abuses, then they're never going to trust your system, your online banking tools anymore, and it's likely that it's going to weaken customer relationship and likely that they're going to move to a competitor, so to another bank. There are also a lot of costs associated with all this. There's the incident firefighting costs, fraud remediation costs, and also customer service and support costs. Those are all costs that ultimately are going to add up. So it truly impacts your top and bottom lines. So what's the solution here? Well, as mentioned earlier, social engineering attacks can have a multi-pronged approach. So it's really critical that you have visibility across all digital channels. I know many of you are probably already have something that's focused on the email channel, but thinking about and having a strategy across all the different channels is important. It's also important to consider prevention, detection, and mitigation strategies for each channel so that you're proactively protecting your customers. It's also important to think about appropriate enforcement strategies. So, for example, If it's a brand enforcement, you can work closely with your legal department, but you could take action on impersonating websites or impersonating social media sites and enforce appropriately. There's also shutdowns, more urgent abuses such as malware or phishing sites that need to be shut down ASAP. So having a capability that's 24/7, 365 days continuously open so that you can take immediate urgent action is also something, a strategy that you should have in place. And last but not least, while you're taking urgent actions, such as like if you're taking down a phishing site, that could take a few hours. So in the meantime, having broadcasting capabilities where you're basically protecting your customers from going and, filling out any phishing sites. Having those kind of capabilities is really important, and it's important to think about how you want to have this in place. So let's talk about best practices. Let's start by talking about what you shouldn't be doing. First things first, do not ignore the issues. Social engineering attacks and fraudulent attacks is a real problem, and it's not going to go away on its own. There's too much money for fraudsters to be making, so, unfortunately, it's something that we cannot ignore. The second thing is don't try to do this manually. As I walked through multiple examples, there are just too many different digital channels to be trying to proactively look for manually, and therefore, the manual approach in the long run is definitely more expensive and less effective. And the third thing that you should absolutely not do is treat all abuses equally. There are more urgent abuses that need immediate action, whereas there are some actions that you could take or enforce upon, but probably can take a longer, 1 or 2 days to enforce upon. So please prioritize the abuses based on its impact on your business. I think that's a really important thing to highlight. Now let's talk about what you should do. So first thing, be proactive. Monitor and proactively protect your bank and customers from any of these fraudulent attacks. The second thing is leverage technologies. There are purpose-built technologies, if you don't already have one, where it will help you prevent, detect, and mitigate these fraudulent activities. Even if you might not think that your bank is a prime, candidate for fraudsters to be attacking, we've seen this time and time again where, it'll be quiet for 1 or 2 years, but suddenly a fraudster decides to take advantage, and then boom, suddenly there are all these attacks, fraudulent attacks happening. So, even if it's an insurance policy, try to think that it is important to continuously monitor and have a proactive strategy and approach. And then last advice is don't just focus on the email channel. Social engineering attacks are definitely taking place across multiple digital channels and in different forms. And as mentioned before, they're multi-pronged. So one campaign could be leveraging different digital channels and different tactics and just causing chaos and problems. And then the last best practice that I'd like to share is please do educate your customers. Make your customers your allies in fighting fraudulent activities. Also, set up an inbox so that customers can easily forward any questionable, information or activity that they're finding. And last but not least, provide best practices. Be proactive in sharing the types of abuses that people are coming across, and people are finding, because the more you get them engaged, then the more likely they're going to be proactive about it and less likely to become victims. So that's something that you could work with your marketing department with as well. So key takeaways before we move into the Q&A session. First, brand fraud-related abuse can potentially be part of a more elaborate social engineering attack. The second thing is fraudsters are continuously evolving their tactics, so have preventative measures in place to minimize risk. So this is, for example, like when we talked about at the domain level, having some kind of an alert system if someone's registering a similar name or domain name to your brand. Those are all red flags that you should be proactively monitoring. And last but not least, be prepared for the worst, so that at any stage of the fraud life cycle, if a fraudster is attacking you, you do have a strategy in place to mitigate and immediately shut down or take action. So with that.
Great. Thank you, Akino, for your informative overview. We are now ready to open up our Q&A session. As a quick reminder, if you have a question, please submit it via the Q&A toolbar on your screen. We'll try to get to all of your questions. However, if we're unable to address them all today, we'll be sure to follow up offline. So we'll go ahead and take our first question of the day.
So here's an interesting question. One of the question is with regards to .bank, because I had mentioned when the sunrise period begins. The question was, when is the general availability going to start? Well, general availability for .bank is going to be June 24th. Well, the claim is June 24th. So that's one of the questions. Another question that we're seeing is, for impersonating websites, what are the types of actions that we've seen fraudsters take? So that's a really good one. The types of actions we've seen is, getting people to set up an account and then steal credentials, or get them to contact them so that they have the domain and email address, and then they can do some kind of money laundering schemes. So there are a whole series of different types of actions that we've seen taking place from impersonating websites.
Okay, I think we're about ready to wrap up our questions for today, if there are no more at this time. Great. Thank you, Akino, for such a great presentation. We appreciate you sharing your experience. I'd also like to thank our audience for your participation. As a final reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar materials, so be on the lookout for that email. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a wonderful day, everyone.